Happy Saturday. Hope you guys are having a good weekend so far. Today we're going to be looking at an English passage in SAT Practice Test 8. So I've posted the link to download the PDF. Posted the link to download the PDF in the chat there. If you have this giant blue book, we're going to be looking at the reading comp passage on page 562. So again, that's 562 in the big blue book, or you can just download the PDF on the link I've posted in the chat. We'll be looking at the passage that's talking about salt. The title of the passage is "Salt Stretches in Nano World." And if that sounds like mumbo jumbo to you, that is a-okay. We're going to teach you how to navigate this. This is one of the trickier passages, and honestly, if you can best this one, you're pretty much set for anything a hard science passage might throw at you. There's some ambiguities. There's some things that are said that seem to mean one thing but actually mean another. And we should be able to navigate it fairly well. As you might have picked up, this is a hard science passage. So if you remember, we have the social sciences in our reading comp. We have narrative fiction, and we have our hard sciences, and we have historical passages. And this hard science, like most of the hard science passages, has to do with chemistry or biology. This one is about chemistry. It's about the physical properties of salt and how it has some unexpected behaviors. But I am not going to spoil anything. Let's just dive right in. It would kind of ruin the point of teaching you SAT practice if I just told you what the main point of the passage was. I'm trying out some dual monitors today, so hopefully the screen sharing doesn't cause any issues. If you can't see what I'm sharing, just let me know in the chat. All right, I'm about to share it right now. Okay, can everyone see the PDF? It says salt stretches in the nano world at the very top. Awesome, thank you. Very, very cool. Glad you're following along. Great, so technology is not always out to get us, it turns out. So what's the first thing we're gonna do in the reading comp? Again, the page in the big blue book is 562. 562, so it's questions 22 to 31 in SAT Practice Test 8. So the first thing that we want to do, obviously, y'all know by now, is read the blurb. And the blurb is going to give us some very important information, especially with these hard science passages where there might be some terms that we're not overly familiar with. So in this case, the title of it, let's see, the passage is adapted from Rachel Ehrenberg, and the title of it is Salt Stretches in Nano World. And here we have a key term being defined for us. The nano world is the world observed on a scale 1/1000th that of ordinary human experience. So if we're talking about nanometers, we're talking about like a billionth of a meter. Nano is a prefix you are hopefully familiar with in your chemistry or biology courses, but you might not be used to seeing this particular term, the nano world. When I was your age, the iPod Nano had just come out, and everyone was freaking out about how small it was. But that's just basically how that prefix is working. It's something that's very, very small. So if we apply that term to our title, salt stretches in the nano world, okay, That's a complete sentence, right? I know exactly what to expect from this passage, hopefully. Next thing we're going to do is not read the passage straight through, we're going to sandwich it. So let's look at basically the first and last sentences of most of these paragraphs, see if we can't get an idea of the basic flow of this passage. So inflexible old salt becomes a softie in the nano world, stretching like taffy to more than twice its length, researchers report. All right, that's a great main idea. That's a great sum up. The work also suggests that these ultra-tiny salt wires may already exist in sea spray and large underground salt deposits. Okay, so it stretches in the nano world. Maybe it stretches in other places too. Then there's a quote about nanowires. Maybe they are more common than we think. Might highlight that just because that looks like an important term. Metals such as gold or lead, in which bonding angles are loosey-goosey, can stretch out at temperatures well below their melting points. Okay, so here we're giving examples of other chemical behaviors. These paragraphs are pretty short, so I'm probably just going to read like first sentence here and there. Yeah, let's wait till we get to a real meaty one here. Moore and his colleagues discovered salt stretchiness accidentally. All right, so as with most science passages, we're sort of going to describe the process of a new discovery. Often, a science passage will go basically like this, like it'll set what everyone's presuppositions are, what we all assumed was true for a long, long time. Then it will build on that and say, here's the new thing we've discovered. And then it will build on that and say, here's where we might find that in the future. So if you think of science passages in this way, think of it as like past, present, and future. Past knowledge, present discovery, future application. Using an electron microscope to see what was happening, last sentence here, the researchers observed the nanowires. Okay, so again, we're just kind of describing the experiment at this point. We might not need the nitty-gritty of that, but we might. The initial attraction between the tip and the salt might be due to electrostatic forces, perhaps good old van der Waals interactions. Whoa, good thing there's a footnote there. What are van der Waals interactions? Aha! Attractive forces between nearby atoms. Okay, well, if it was important enough to define, it's important for us to understand, usually. The surface tension is so strong that the microscope pulls away from the salt. As the microscope pulls away from the salt stretches, Kempa says. The inside has no choice but to rearrange the atoms rather than break. All right, so we're restating this main idea. Salt is stretching. This bizarre behavior is actually mirrored in the macro world, the researchers say. Okay, so we're talking about how this applies larger. Again, present knowledge or present discovery to future application. And if we skip down to this last paragraph, the work also suggests new techniques. See what I mean? Future applications here. For making nanowires, which are often created through nano imprinting techniques, Kempa says. We invoke the intuition of the macro world, he says. Maybe instead of stamping nanowires, we should be nano pooling them. Now, the term macro world, we're supposed to sort of define that out. If the nano world is everything that's very, very small, the macro world is just kind of the world that you and I live in, the world of large things. That would be clear if you've studied anything like macroeconomics, things at a large scale. But if you don't know what that means, let's just wait to see if what the questions tell us is important to know. Because especially with these hard science passages, we don't want to waste our time trying to figure out what everything means. We just need to get enough information to get us through the questions. So let's look at what we got question-wise. Oh, and who could forget? Graphs, everyone's favorite. We'll come back to this guy for sure. All right, let's look at our first question then. So we've read the blurb, we've sandwiched the passage. Now you might say, Mr. Scott, I could have read the passage in the time it took you to sandwich it. You probably could, but when you're sandwiching it on your own, you're going to be able to go through it much more quickly than I've been able to, right? You won't be explaining it out loud. Let's see if I can't. Here we go. It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to use Ink2Go today, however. But that is okay. You can mark these along in your book, or you can certainly. Oh, here we go. Yeah, you can mark the things that I'm marking in your book, or you can also yeah, just follow along in that way. Hopefully you remember the categories that we're assigning to these, right? We're looking at broad questions, vocab and context questions, line questions, and graph and data interpretation questions. And you better believe that we're going to have some graph and some data interpretation for sure. So one central idea of the passage is that, well, that has all the markings of a broad question. On test day, I would circle this, come back to it later. Today, I'll just highlight it. Yeah, why not get fancy? Blue for broad. Which choice best describes the overall structure of the passage? Well, this also seems like a broad question. We're asking about the passage overall, right? So we're not going to have a good idea of the overall structure until we answer some more of these. Which choice provides the best evidence for the claim that Moore's group was surprised to observe salt stretching? As you can see, we're being given a whole bunch of different a whole bunch of different lines as our options. So this is clearly a line question. Let's see here. Line question, lime green. That's what I say. So we'll come back to this and we'll answer it certainly before the blue broad questions, but not the ones that we answer first. As used in line 20, rule most nearly means. Well, this is clearly a vocab and context question, right? We're going to answer this right away. On test day, I would write a V there. For now, vocab will be violet. Look at number 26. According to the passage, researchers have identified which mechanism as potentially responsible to the initial attraction between the microscope tip and the salt. Well, we're not being given anything more specific than according to the passage. That has all the markings of a broad question. We're not going to be tricked into wasting our time answering that before we know more about what we're dealing with. As used in line 42, lead to most nearly means. Well, that is defining a phrase, not necessarily a word, but it is definitely more of a vocab in context question. We'll answer those before we answer anything else. Based on the passage, which choice best describes the relationship between salt behavior in the nano world and in the macro world? Well, this seems like a broad question, right? Based on the phrase, based on the passage. But remember what I said, whenever we see a broad question, especially one at the bottom of a column or page, always just peep over to the next one to see if they're not connected to something else. And it turns out it is. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? These are our lime green line questions. Okay, so we're going to answer those before we get to our blue broad questions. According to the information in the graph, I will read no further. We are interpreting a graph. So that's our graph and data interpretation questions. When I say graph, gets a dark green. Same here. Okay, so now we're going to answer these in order, right? What do we go for first? First, we go for our violet vocab questions. As used in line 20, rule most nearly means what? Well, let's look at the context. This unusual behavior, starting with line 19, highlights that different forces rule the nanoworld, says theoretical physicist Chris Divkempa of Boston College. We don't really need all this context, right? We're mostly looking at this phrase. So what other words might we throw in there? Different forces rule the nanoworld. Well, if we're a little confused, we might keep reading. Forget about gravity, it plays no role, she says. So gravity is a force that is not ruling the nanoworld. Okay, so we're talking about forces like gravity in the way, we're talking about rule in the way that things like gravity rule you and me. So it's not like a ruler. Gravity isn't measuring me. It's not exactly like a king. Gravity isn't giving me a law that I can obey or deny. Gravity rules me in kind of an uncontrollable way. It controls me. There's no will behind it. It's just a necessity. That's why we call it the law of gravity. So if we think of some words that we could punch in there, but we have the basic idea, right? For ruling the nanoworld, it's forces that control the nanoworld. And lo and behold, control is one of our synonyms here. That mark the nanoworld isn't really going to work. Again, that's more like a ruler, or that's like ruled line paper, right? Declaring, forces like gravity aren't declaring anything. Gravity can't speak. Restraining comes closer. It has two strikes against it. One, it does seem to imply more of a will, and two, I don't think that like gravity always restrains. It holds things together, but restraint is more of an unwanted bonding, right? So I would say control is much better. That's what these forces are not doing on the nanoworld. Let's look at our next violet vocab question. As used in line 42, lead to most nearly means. All right, hopping ahead. (41), 42. Several mechanisms might lead to the elasticity, including the excessive surface tension found in the nanoworld, the same tension that allows a water strider to skim the surface of a pond. I don't know if you guys have ever seen bugs like that. They have those like long legs with sort of flat feet, and they can walk across the water. That's what a water strider is. But we don't need to know about bugs to understand the meaning of the phrase lead to. So what might lead to elasticity, like something being more elastic? Well, we talk about surface tension, possibly making it more elastic. That's something that is leading to. So we're not actually talking about a journey, right? In the same way that I might lead you to the water fountain. I'm also not leading you to a conclusion. This isn't convincing. This isn't a physical journey. This is more of a cause and effect. So like several mechanisms might cause elasticity. Let's see if we can find any synonyms that come close to that meaning of the word lead to. Guide to, again, no, not a physical journey. Result in seems a lot closer to the idea of cause and effect. Let's mark that for now. Point toward, again, that's more of me leading you to a conclusion, or maybe like to a physical place. But we're not talking about a physical place, we're talking about a state of elasticity. We're talking about a state of being. In the same way that I might say a movie led me to tears. It's that sort of thing. We're being led to a state of being, not to a physical place or an idea. And start with, well, let's see, leading to elasticity and starting with elasticity. That's kind of moving in the wrong direction, right, of cause and effect. We're saying that a mechanism causes elasticity. But if a mechanism starts with elasticity, that means it's going the other way around. That elasticity causes these mechanisms. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that this leads to this. So several mechanisms might result in elasticity, right? The final result will be that elasticity. Okay, we have solved all of our violet vocab questions. Let's move on to our lime green line questions, shall we? We won't have to read the whole passage, but we will navigate certain parts of the passage that will give us better ideas of the passage as a whole. Hopefully you know what I mean by now, but if not, watch and learn. Which choice provides the best evidence for the claim that Moore's group was surprised to observe salt stretching? Okay, so here, we've got to look for our key words. The answer is somewhere in here, and it has to do something with this. We're looking for the best evidence, so there might be some that's good, but we want the best. It has to be about Moore's group, and it has to be about how they're surprised, specifically about salt stretching. So let's see which of these, first of all, is about Moore's group. Second of all, about this emotion in regard to this state. If it doesn't hit all three, we're not interested. Line 17 to 18, starting with but and ending with says. But scientists don't expect this super elasticity in a rigid crystalline material like salt, Moore says. Well, if we think of synonyms to our key words, right? Think of synonyms for surprise, we might think unexpected. And if we think of salt stretching, we've already seen the idea of elastic, right? Elasticity. Now, Morse is saying this. Scientists don't expect this super elasticity, but it's not necessarily saying that Moore's group was surprised. This is just Moore saying that people in general don't expect it. Still, it's pretty good. So I'm going to mark it, and we'll see if we come back to it later. Lines 26 to 28, starting with they were and ending with testing. They were investigating how water sticks to a surface, such as salt, and created a super dry salt sample for testing. I mean, cool. We're definitely talking about Moore's team, but we're more just talking about what they did, not how they felt. So I don't like B. Let's look at C, lines 36 to 38, starting with using and ending with nanowires. Oh, we've already read this. Using an electron microscope to see what was happening, the researchers observed the nanowires. Again, we're just seeing what they did. We're not seeing how they felt. So that's a strike for option C. 55 to 56, starting with sodium and ending with says. Sodium chloride, well, we want to look that up, common salt. If you didn't know that already, that's what salt is. Sodium chloride is everywhere, in the air, in our bodies, Moore says. Okay, so cool, salt is everywhere, but this isn't about Moore's team, and it's certainly not about the emotion of surprise. So while option A wasn't a clear home run, of these options, it is certainly the best one we have. Let's look at our next line question. This linked one, 28 and 29. Based on the passage, which choice best describes the relationship between salt behavior in the nano world and the macro world? So we need something about salt behavior. If this is just more talking about what kind of sandwich he likes to eat for lunch, that's not what we're interested in. It has to be about salt behavior in the nano world, where things are very small, and in the macro world, the world where you and I live in, where things are very, very big, at least compared to individual atoms. So we know that it has to include these kinds of things. So again, let's think of synonyms for these keywords, because we might not find them like this. We might find something like sodium chloride. We might find something like salt crystals. In terms of their behavior, well, what have we mostly been talking about? We've been mostly talking about how salt stretches, right? Salt behavior isn't like good or bad behavior, it's just what it does. And what we're most interested in is that stretchiness. We've seen the word elasticity used. So those are some good words to look out for. Nano world, macro world, I mean, we could definitely look at the like microscopic, perhaps, atomic world. The macro world, well, let's just say it's larger, right? Anything that says like the big world or larger scales, perhaps. These might all seem silly, but stretching our brains in this way, thinking about these words not just as the words appear, but what the words mean, it's going to help us as we navigate this passage. So one of these choices is going to help us with this question in particular. Let's check it out. Lines 12 to 13, starting with maybe and ending with think. Maybe they are more common than we think. Okay, well, who's they? That's a fair question, right? They is nanowires. All right. I don't see anything particularly about salt, though, right? We definitely seem to be talking about, well, maybe the small and the big here. I don't know. I think we can do better. I think we can do better than A. But let's flag it for right now. So just underline A here. B, lines 22 to 24, starting with surface and ending with scale. Forget about gravity. It plays no role, he says. Now, starting the actual section, surface tension and electrostatic forces are much more important at this scale. Okay, that's really not about salt. We're talking about small things, and we're talking about like the forces at play, but we're not talking about the behavior of our chemical of interest. So I'm gonna cross that out because you're not telling me anything about how salt behaves. That's all I'm interested in. Lines 39 to 42, starting with the initial and ending with speculate. The initial attraction between the tip and salt might be due to electrostatic forces, perhaps good old van der Waals interactions. The researchers speculate. Come on. Well, okay, that's about the attraction of salt to, I think, the microscope tip is what we're talking about. But if we're using a microscope tip, that means we're talking about salt on a small scale, right? We got to read between the lines here. We're not talking about salt in the macro world, only in the nano world. So C is out. 51 to 53, starting with huge and ending with scales. Huge underground deposits of salt can bend like plastic, but water is believed to play a role at these scales. Okay, well, this one also, it only seems to be talking about the macro world, perhaps. But if we look at the context, we are talking about its relationship to the nano world, right? This bizarre behavior is actually mirrored in the macro world. What bizarre behavior? We got to follow that trail of breadcrumbs. The behavior of the salt stretching on the microscopic level. We know what happens here based on the context, and building on that, we know what also happens in the macro world. So right now, A and D are our best candidates. Do we like one better than the other? Let's look at 12 again. Maybe nanowires are more common than we think. Yeah, this isn't really about salt behavior, is it? D is really the thing that talks about salt on the microscopic level and the context of salt on the normal real world. Well, it's all real, but the normal large world behavior going on. Oh, why'd I cross that out? That's our right answer. So let's look at question 28 rather. Right after we figure out what is this actually saying? Well, we figured it out, right? We've followed this trail of breadcrumbs. Huge deposits of salt can bend like plastic. In the context of salt on the nano world can stretch. So it seems that this property is present on a small scale, but also present on a larger one as well. And right away we have A. In both the nano world and the macro world, salt can be flexible. That seems pretty good. Let's keep looking. Salt flexibility is expected in the nano world, but is surprising in the macro world. Well, I don't see anyone being surprised at the bendability of these huge deposits. So while that might be tempting, I don't think it's as good as A. C, salt nanowires were initially observed in the nano world and later observed in the macro world. Well, do we get that from this passage? No, we have no idea of the timeline of discovery here. So I would cross out C as well. In the nano world, salt's interactions with water lead to very different properties than they do in the macro world. That's almost the exact opposite of what we're saying. Salt's interactions with water is also only something we're looking at in the macro world here, right? Water is playing a role here. We don't see anything about water here necessarily. So for that reason, I would go with A. Notice also how A is the broadest possible answer, right? It's flexible here and it's flexible here. It doesn't go in for those specific, like sniper rifle questions that are saying, you know, like, oh, it's expected here, but it's a surprise over here. It was first here, but later it was here. If either of these two things are true, right, then this is true. The broad answer is correct. It's in the specifics that we trip ourselves up. Now, the broadest answer isn't always the correct one, but if you notice that sort of relationship between your answers, right, tend to the one that causes the least trouble. That makes the broadest possible argument that no one could really disagree with based on the passage. Okay, so we've looked at our vocab questions. We've looked at our line questions. Now, the question is, do we look at our graph or our broad questions first? Well, let's just see how broad these broad questions are. Central ideas of the passage, overall structure of the passage. Well, yeah, that's pretty broad. I would recommend going to the broad questions before the data interpretation questions, only if you know this about yourself, that your brain is completely switching gears when you're reading a graph, right? If you have to like just completely downshift into math mode to read a graph, and it's going to be too much of a transition, there's going to be too much time lost getting back to the passage, then I would recommend answering your broad questions first, and then, you know, just zipping through those graph questions. We're going to do the graph questions first here because they won't take very long, and I think they will give us some added context. So according to the information in the graph, when the microscope tip is moving away from the salt surface and is 15 nanometers from the surface, what is the approximate force on the microscope tip in micronewtons? Whoa, there's a lot that's getting thrown at us here. Now, a brief glance reveals that while both of these are about the microscope tip and the salt surface, these are actually two different graphs. One about the microscope tip moving toward the salt, and one about it moving away. The nice thing about these data interpretation questions is they narrow it down for you if we're paying attention. So according to the information in the graph, noted, of course we're looking at the graph, when the microscope tip is moving away from the salt surface, okay, what does that mean? That means we are only interested in this. The tip moving away from the salt surface. Can't highlight it without highlighting the S. That's just fine. We're only interested in this graph, okay? So don't even pay attention to the other one for now. And is 15 nanometers from the surface. All right, well, let's look at our axes. We have the force on tip in micronewtons. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the distance from the tip to surface in nanometers, okay? And what's it interested in? 15 nanometers from the surface. We're zeroing in on our answer. It's 15 nanometers here. Pay attention to the labeling of the axes and pay attention to the units being used. What is the approximate force on the microscope tip in micronewtons? Okay, so now we're answering for that other axis, right? There's the force on the tip in micronewtons over here when the distance to the tip is about 15 nanometers. And where are we at? Well, we're in this zone right here. Now, as Mr. Anthony and others will tell you, do not be a hero. Don't break out your ruler and divide these quadrants into perfect tenths to try and figure it out. You're never going to be forced to choose between like 0.74 and 0.77 in a graph like this. It's always going to be pretty obvious. Somewhere between 0.5 and 1.0 in micronewtons. And honestly, it is about halfway there. So what's between 0.5 and 1.0? Only one answer, right? We can eliminate these right away because they're either below 0.5 or above 1.0. See, that seems intimidating at first, but when we pay attention to the information the question is giving us and the information the answer provides, it honestly narrows down quite a bit. Now, this is based on the passage and the graph. So I'll say, you know what, let's come back to this later because I'm going to need to get to know the passage a little bit better based on my broad questions. Haven't forgotten about you graph questions. Haven't forgotten. One central idea of the passage. Okay, so not necessarily the main idea, but at least one central idea, is that either A, sometimes materials behave contrary to expectations. Well, we definitely see that in our other questions, right? If things weren't behaving in a contrary way, where's that question about Moore's group? Yeah, if things weren't behaving in a contrary way, Moore's group wouldn't be surprised, right? It's unexpected, contrary to expectations. That's one of our surprise synonyms. So let's mark A. Also, that's pretty broad, so it's hard to disagree with. B, systems can be described in terms of inputs and outputs. Well, I mean, that's not untrue, but is it a point of the passage? I don't know. I think even in our sandwiching, we probably would have come upon something like that. This isn't about systems. This is about salt. We're only using the symptoms to learn more about what salt does. C, models of materials have both strengths and weaknesses. I mean, this is something you might be familiar with if you're in a chemistry course. You may have learned about the atomic models, right? You have the planetary models, maybe the old Greek models of the atom, the plum pudding model, if you want to really get into it. But is that what this passage is about? Like, it's not wrong. It's a true statement, but it's not in this passage. So no, I don't like C. D, properties of systems differ from the properties of their parts. Again, where's all this talk of systems? We're talking about salt. Systems hardly come into play. I don't think that's a central idea of the passage, far from it. I think our strongest answer, far and away, is A for number 22. Look at that, we knocked it out of the park. Let's look at number 23. Which choice best describes the overall structure of the passage? Well, based on what we've read, where does it seem to move to? Again, we're describing the behavior of a material. Here we describe exactly, the experiment. And if you want, you can read this whole paragraph. I mean, it may be helpful to actually read this because this is what the graph is based on. After cleaving a chunk of salt about the size of a sugar cube with a razor, the scientists guided a microscope that detects forces toward the surface. When the tip was far away, there was no measured force, but within about 7 nanometers, a very strong attraction rapidly developed between the diamond tip of the microscope and the salt. The salt actually stretched out to glom onto the microscope tip. Okay, that's exactly what we're seeing in those graphs, right? But now we actually see, we actually have a story to attach to it. Some of you might not need that. Some of you might look at a graph and you're like, that's all the data I need. Some of you, if you're like me, may actually kind of need a narrative behind what's going on. That's such a fun word, though, to glom onto something. I challenge you all to use that in your next research paper, for sure. If you can find anything that gloms onto anything else, I don't know what your teacher will give, but you'll be getting extra credit points from me, 100%. So what describes the overall structure of the passage? Got a little sidetracked there. We are looking at the behavior of a material. We're looking at the experiment that led to the discovery. And we're looking at the relationship between micro and macro. We've seen that over and over and over again in these questions. Then salt stretches, salt is flexible in both the micro and the macro, it turns out. And maybe in future application, this may allow us to make nanowires. If you don't know what a nanowire is, well, use your noggin. If you know what nano means, it's just a very small wire, okay? So that's honestly all that's going on there. So what answer best fits what we already know? So A, a list of several ways in which salt's properties differ from researchers' expectations. Well, this is an okay answer. I don't know about several ways. We're not talking about like, salt stretches, and also it burns at really low temperatures, and also it, blooms when you put it in a vacuum. Like that's a little weaker. I'll flag it. I won't cross it out right away, but let's see if we can do something better. B, a presentation of a hypothesis regarding salt behavior, description of an associated experiment, and explanations of why the results weaken the hypothesis. Well, we definitely have an experiment. I don't know that those results weaken it, though. The experiment that we read about supported the hypothesis. So I don't like B. That'll trip you up, though, because it seems to like walk you through really well. C, a description of 2 salt crystal experiments, the apparent disagreement in the results. Okay, no, we only have 1 salt crystal experiment. C is out right away. D, an introduction to an interesting salt property. Okay, check, salt stretches. A description of its discovery. Check, we get the experiment. And speculation regarding its application. Boom. That's also like every science passage ever. Past, present, and future application. D is our money answer. Sorry, option A. According to the passage, number 26, this is our next broad question, and our last broad question, actually, before we answer that final data interpretation question. According to the passage, researchers have identified which mechanism as potentially responsible for the initial attraction between the microscope tip and the salt. Okay, so we're looking for what? A mechanism. That might be, a force. That might be a system, if we really want to use what those other questions were trying to trip us up on. It's responsible for what? The attraction between the microscope tip and the salt. So that diamond tip of the microscope that measures the force, and the salt that it's attracted to. So we're not really given any clues about where to look, except that it has to be somewhere around where we're talking about the experiment, right? Because we can't learn anything about a microscope tip in any of this part of the passage because we haven't even brought up the experiment using the microscope. This just describes what was done with the microscope tip. But let's look right after here. The initial attraction, whoa, okay, that's the exact phrase. The initial attraction between the tip and the salt. The initial attraction between the tip and the salt might be due to electrostatic forces, perhaps good old van der Waals interactions. Okay, I see two possible answers here. Gravity, no. Nanoimprinting, no. Surface tension, no. Van der Waals interactions, 100%. We would never have to choose, by the way, between two correct answers in this sense. Like they would never give electrostatic forces as one option and van der Waals interactions as another. These are like synonymous choices in this case. So there we go. All right, we're zipping through. Now we just have one question left. And it can be super intimidating because it's based on both the passage, blue for broad, and the graph, dark green for graph. Was that necessary? No, but why not stay consistent? Which label on the graph indicates the point at which a salt nanowire breaks? Okay, so we're looking for where the nanowire breaks. It's going to be on one of these two graphs. So before we were just interested on this one, but now we're given these four possible points. So let's look back at our narrative here. What's going on with the diamond tip and the salt surface? So we're seeing the salt actually stretch out onto the microscope tip, right? And while this may seem very complicated, right? What's a point at which the salt nanowire breaks? Well, this doesn't even talk about when it breaks, right? We're talking about it stretching. Not to worry. We have to use our heads and we have to infer a little bit here. So just think for a minute what you know about stretchy things. Say you have like silly putty or even Play-Doh or even a rubber band. At some point, if you stretch it, it's going to break. Now, if I think of one end of the rubber band as the base of the salt, right? And I'm pulling that rubber band out. I'm pulling that salt strand away. I don't know if you guys can actually see me. I'm gonna unshare my screen. So if I have like one end of the rubber band here, that's the base of the salt. And I'm pulling it away, that's the stretching. This question is asking, when is the strand going to break? Well, what makes sense? Let's narrow it down to these two graphs. Is it going to break, if we think of this as the diamond tip of the microscope, is the rubber band going to break as I'm moving away or as I'm moving towards its origin. It's going to break as I'm moving away, right? As I stretch it more and more and more, eventually it's going to snap. It's not going to happen when I'm moving toward the salt surface. So right away, that cancels this whole graph out. We've canceled out these choices, P, Q, and R. It's none of these. So it's either S or T. Now, think of that rubber band again. When it breaks, how much force is there going to be between the thing being stretched and the thing doing the stretching? Well, if it's broken, then there's no more stretching going on. There's zero force being exerted. And where do we see force equals 0? That's at point T, right here. Option D, that's how we get there. Okay, so that may have seemed like a lot to hold in your head at one time regarding, a chemical property you probably never heard of. And if it seemed that way, that's because it is that way. You're absolutely right. There's a lot to keep track of in this hard science passage in particular. But we got through it, and you have all the tools to do this. So I want to encourage you, like if you can make it through this hard science passage, you can pretty much make it through any hard science passage. That's one of the trickier ones.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.